In the little Central Texas farming community where I grew up, the old farmers I was surrounded by listened to two types of music, country and Western. And as a kid, I hated it. I hated everything about it. Country and Western just reminded me of all those old farmers in town I couldn't stand. And heck, the country singers even looked and acted like them. Cowboy hats, big buckles, boots, mean, intolerant, always whining and complaining about stuff and trying to tell other people how to live their lives. Plus, the music itself was just boring. It bored me to sleep. And on the farm where I grew up, we could pick up only gospel and country and Western stations and forget MTV. That didn't make it out to the farm until I was almost out of high school. So as a little kid, I thought, I don't like music. That all changed when a kid named Jason transferred into our class. Now, Jason's maternal family was actually from our little farming community, but his mom had gotten married, moved away, had kids, and was back, so technically, Jason was a new kid. And we hit it off almost immediately, staying over each other's house on the weekends. We would stay up late playing Atari, watching VCR tapes our moms had rented for us, and, if we were at Jason's, listening to music. Jason's dad, Greg, loved rock and roll, and Greg had a massive record collection. Classic rock, new rock, heavy metal, blues. Greg loved it all, and Jason had this sixth sense for knowing I needed to hear it. Def Leppard's Pyromania, Quiet Riot's Metal Health, Van Halen's 1984. The music was so exciting and fun. It didn't make me want to go to sleep. It made me want to run and jump and sing. And those rock stars, they didn't look like farmers. They looked like superheroes. And they weren't singing about tractors or complaining about where their ex-wives lived. Who cares? Or whining because they couldn't get with a lady. Rock stars were singing about partying and being with their friends. And rock stars almost always got the girls. And there was one band that Jason introduced me to that we both absolutely loved. And that was AC/DC. Back in Black, Problem Child, Hell's Bells, It's a Long Way to the Top, TNT. But there was one AC/DC album we were forbidden from listening to, and that was the Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap album. And anytime Jason would grab it and try to put it on the record player, his mom would go, "Jason Ross Olsen," and give us that look that all moms know how to give, and Jason would put it back. But one morning, we got up real early before his parents, and we snuck downstairs. Jason got his dad's giant headset and plugged it into the stereo. I put one side of it on my left ear. Jason pressed his face next to mine and put the right side on his right ear, that big headset spanning our little kid heads, our cheeks smushed together. And I could feel Jason giggling as he dropped the needle. Now, the song starts off with Angus Young's descending and ascending series of power chords. Bum, 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 bum. And it gives the song this really grimy feel. And then Bon Scott's heavily Australian accented voice starts pompously crooning. Well, I'm upper class high society, God's gift to ballroom notoriety. And I always fill my ballroom, the event is never small. The social pages say, I've got the biggest balls of all. Well, I've got big balls, dirty big balls. He's got big balls, and she's got big balls. And then this entire choir joins in. We've got the biggest balls of them all. That song, Big Balls, was the reason we were not allowed to listen to the Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap album. That song is so much fun, though. As far as I can recollect, the Oak Ridge Boys never sang about their balls. And besides that, it's a super inclusive song. According to AC/DC, everyone has big balls. It felt like Jason and I shared something special with rock and roll, and we swore it brothers for the rest of our lives. Rock and roll was our bond, and it served as our personal oasis in a desert of country and Western music. As we got older, we spent almost every day together and every weekend. During our teens, we would stay down at my family's river cabin for weeks on end, having parties that seemed to last forever, with rock and roll blaring up and down the Brazos River. And if anybody had the temerity at one of our parties to ask, hey, man, can't y'all play at least like one or two country songs? We'd say, sure. And then we would promptly play Pantera's Cowboys from Hell. And if you don't know that song, it ain't country. Immediately after high school, despite all the warnings from both family and friends, I got married. And that doomed relationship lasted about 9 months before that soul shaker took everything I had. And when that ended, I was in a really dark, depressed place. I was ashamed at how badly I'd let myself be treated, and I isolated myself, and I refused to leave my little trailer house for weeks. One day I heard a knock on the door. I ignored it. More knocking. Kept ignoring it. Then I heard Jason on the front porch. Open the door, I'm just going to kick it the fuck in. All I wanted to do was hide in the dark and wallow in my depression, but I unlocked the door because I knew Jason, he would have kicked it in or ripped the door off the hinges. When he came in, he didn't even ask me how I was. He took one look at me and goes, get dressed and get in the truck. I knew him well enough to know that no was not an answer. Either I was going with him or we were fighting, and I did not have the energy to fight. So I got in his pickup, and he drove us down to the river cabin. We sat on the porch. We drank cold Dr. Peppers and smoked Marlboros and listened to music as we watched the slow, lazy waters of the Brazos River flow by. And we didn't even talk. But it was like Jason knew, just like he knew that I needed to hear rock and roll, he knew I needed to get out of that trailer house and try to live my life again. And if I wasn't going to do it myself, he was going to make me. And he couldn't have been a better friend to me in that moment. Jason and I lost touch in our 20s. I was dating a girl who was part of our friend group, and when I broke up with her, I thought he took her side in the breakup, when in reality, he was probably just trying to be a good friend to both of us. But I am not a smart man. And I got mad at him, and I stopped talking to him. And before I knew it, I had moved to San Antonio, gotten remarried, was in graduate school, and more than 10 years had passed since I'd seen my very best friend. It was like there was a hole in my heart where he was supposed to be. But I was too stupid and stubborn to call him. And then one day, out of the blue, my cell phone rang. And it was Jason. I had the same number from the 90s, and he remembered it. And I picked up, and it was like not a day had passed. He didn't even acknowledge that there had been a rift. It was like his sixth sense had kicked in, and he knew that I needed him back in my life, even if it was just over the phone. He'd been gone too long, and I was glad he was back. And while I didn't get to see him every day or every week or hell, even every month, he was back in my life. And anytime my wife and I would go back to the farm, we'd make a point to meet up, and it would be like not a day had passed. In 2014, my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and her prognosis was not good. So I started spending a lot more time back home on the farm, and it was a rough time. I was essentially watching my mom die in slow motion. Thankfully, my job was such that I could spend extended periods of time back home on the farm, but my wife has a real job, and her presence is required there, so she couldn't be with me all the time. And so it was pretty rough, because she's usually my anchor when I feel adrift. But the one thing that kept me sane during that time period was Jason randomly showing up at Mom and Dad's house, just like he used to do when we were teenagers. He'd come by after he got off work. He'd sit with Mom on the couch and laugh and joke like she wasn't even sick. He'd come by in the middle of the night when he knew she was sleeping, but I couldn't sleep. When things got bad and I was up at the hospital, he'd send me goofy gifts. He would send me funny texts when I was at hospice. It was like his sixth sense was kicking in, and he knew I could not do this alone. And when Mom did die, it was just me, my dad, and my wife trying to do everything. It was overwhelming. Trying to find time to actually grieve, while also holding court and trying to comfort a lot of people I didn't even know, and also having to make funeral arrangements. But there are a couple of things about the funeral arrangements that I knew for sure. The first was I wanted Jason as a pallbearer. Mom had loved him like a son, and hell, sometimes I think she liked hanging around with him more than me. And it gave me a lot of comfort to know that my best friend was going to carry my mom to her final resting place. The other thing that I knew was that I was going to do the eulogy. And I knew it for two reasons. One, I told people, and the other I kept to myself. One reason was Mom and I were not religious, and the last thing I wanted was some country bumpkin fire and brimstone preacher that Mom didn't even know using her funeral as an excuse to preach. But the reason I did not share was I knew that I could use writing, practicing, and performing the eulogy like a dam to hold back the deep blue waves of sadness that were threatening to pull me down and drown me. So I gave the eulogy. And yeah, there were some tears, but man, that dam held. I treated it like a storytelling event or a lecture. The audience didn't know it, but I even held a pen in my hand like I would typically hold a marker in the classroom. I sat back down, and the service started to conclude, and people started to process past the casket to give their respects to Mom, and then they started to file past to give their respects to the family. And again, I was in teacher mode or performance mode. I was meeting students or an audience after a storytelling show. This wasn't Mom's funeral. It wasn't real. And then I saw Jason and his mom and dad get to the casket, and his mom and dad said their respects to my mom, and then they lined up to process past the family. Not Jason. He got to the casket, he said his respects to Mom, and he turned around and he immediately locked eyes with me. And then he pushed his way through the crowd and he charged over, and he pulled me up from the pew, and he wrapped his arms around me and he held me. And he pressed his cheek right next to mine, just like he had done when we listened to Big Balls together, except this time, instead of feeling him giggle, I could feel him crying. And that fucking dam broke. And those waves crashed over me. And I would have fallen to the ground if my best friend hadn't been holding me. It was like he knew. He knew, man. Like he knew I needed to hear rock and roll. Like he knew he needed to drag me out of that trailer house. Like he knew to call me on the cell phone. He knew that the guy up there giving that eulogy and sitting in the pew shaking hands was full of shit. And he knew if I wasn't going to let myself grieve, well, damn it, he was going to make me. Later that night, after the funeral and the graveside service, my wife and I and a very small group of my friends went down to the river cabin where in my youth I'd spent so many hours partying. But that night I cried on that porch. We also laughed and joked because Mom would have preferred that. And we also listened to a hell of a lot of rock and roll. Van Halen, Metallica, and lots of AC/DC. Heavy decibels from those guitars thundered up and down the banks of the Brazos River as my wife and closest friends helped me say goodbye to my mom in my own way. And one song that played that night that brought me a lot of comfort is AC/DC's Highway to Hell. Now, I know that might sound weird if you've never heard the song. But the first verse of that song goes like this. Living easy, loving free. Season ticket on a one-way ride. Asking nothing, leave me be. Taking everything in my stride. Don't need reason, don't need rhyme. There ain't nothing I'd rather do. We going down? It's party time. My friends are going to be there too. I'm on the highway to hell. I don't know what happens after this life. It's probably nothing. But if there is something, I sure hope they're playing rock and roll. Because if they're playing rock and roll, I know one thing for damn sure. My friend is going to be there too. Thank you.